The ballroom of Ashworth House blazed with the restless light of 100 candles, each flame trembling, as the orchestra drew its bow across strings in that measured predatory dance of the Yuletide season. Garlands of holly and ivy wound between marble columns, their berries catching the gaslight with theatrical precision. The air hung thick with perfume, beeswax, and the unspoken law that governed every breath drawn within these walls: propriety above all else, reputation as currency, and belonging as a privilege granted only to those whose names bore sufficient weight. Clara Hemsley stood at the periphery of the grand ballroom, her gloved fingers folded tightly over the cream-colored dance card that had been pressed into her hand upon arrival. The card, she had learned within minutes of the evening's commencement, would remain blank. Not a single name had been inscribed there, despite Mrs. Merrow's discreet encouragement. The other young ladies, fair, jeweled, assured of their place in the carefully choreographed hierarchy, moved through the space with the ease of those who had never once doubted their right to be observed, admired, claimed. Clara's gown, a modest pine green wool trimmed with cream stitching, seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight. It was the dress of a companion, a paid attendant, a woman of education, but no inheritance. It was the dress of someone who ought not to expect a partner for the quadrille, let alone the waltz. The orchestra launched into a lively cotillion. The floor swelled with color: crimson silks, silver satins, the flash of diamond bracelets as ladies turned and curtsied in time with the music. Clara watched. She had learned over the past 4 months in Mrs. Merrow's service that watching was safer than hoping. Too provincial for even the second rank, a voice said nearby, high, crystalline, and designed to travel just far enough to reach the intended target. Lady Rosamond Vale stood with her coterie of adherents, her blonde curls arranged with the precision of a crown, her scarlet gown a declaration of unquestionable beauty. Mrs. Merrow's companion, I hear, as if ancient widows require moral guidance from daughters of country physicians. A ripple of laughter, carefully modulated to remain within the bounds of ladylike behavior, circled the group. Clara felt the familiar weight settle in her chest. The sensation of being a shadow among objects meant to shine. The waltz would begin soon. She had heard the musicians conferring, seen them readying their instruments for the grand dance that would mark the midpoint of the evening. In a proper ballroom, the waltz represented a kind of apotheosis, an opportunity for the young ladies to be seen in the arms of gentlemen of rank, their eligibility affirmed before an assembly of witnesses. Clara would not waltz tonight. This knowledge had arrived with certainty the moment Lady Rosamond completed her observation. The ton moved as a single organism, responding to unspoken commands passed through glances and whispers. What Rosamond had declared would be law by the time the first note sounded. Miss Hemsley. The voice cut through her reverie like a blade sheathed in velvet. Clara turned to find Mrs. Althea Merrow, her elderly patroness, approaching with the deliberate slowness of one whose cane was both prop and weapon. The widow's dark eyes, sharp as winter frost, had witnessed the entire exchange. "You appear quite melancholy. Surely the season demands a lighter countenance." "I am content, ma'am," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her fingertips. "The evening is very fine." "The evening is precisely as cruel as it wishes to be," Mrs. Merrow said, positioning herself beside Clara with a slight adjustment of her ivory shawl. "And some people in this room are determined to practice their particular species of cruelty." She paused, and some calculation, some decision, flickered across her weathered features. "But we shall see." The orchestra fell silent. The moment had arrived. "You don't belong here," a voice said. Clara's breath caught. The words, when spoken aloud in a ballroom full of listening ears, fell with the weight of a sentence. She turned, already knowing who had spoken them, because only a voice of considerable authority would dare to pronounce such words in public, and only someone confident of his right to do so would bother to transform her private shame into his public verdict. Prince Adrian of Westmarch stood at the entrance to the ballroom, his tall frame rendered nearly shadowless by the candlelight behind him. His charcoal coat bore the insignia of his rank with austere dignity. His grey eyes, beneath neatly combed dark hair, surveyed the assembled company with the expression of a man fulfilling an obligation he found, at this particular moment, singularly distasteful. But those eyes were fixed upon Clara. The music had not yet begun. The dancers had not yet assumed their positions, yet in the space created by the prince's pronouncement, something shifted. The ton ceased its chatter. Fans stilled in mid-gesture. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath. "You do not belong in this ballroom, Miss Hemsley," Prince Adrian continued, his voice measured, formal, edged with something that might have been justice or might have been mere protocol. "Your presence here is an error of judgment on the part of your patroness. I suggest you remove yourself before the waltz commences. The sight of you at the edge of these proceedings would be unseemly." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara felt her hand tighten on the dance card, that useless blank card that had become, in a single moment, the physical embodiment of her exclusion. The breath she had been holding escaped in a small, barely audible sound. Around her, the Tan watched with the fascination of those witnessing a public reckoning, their faces arranged in expressions of concern so perfectly calibrated that they bordered on theatrical. Mrs. Merrow's grip on her cane tightened, but Clara Hemsley, in that moment of absolute humiliation, did not flee. Instead, she lifted her chin very slightly, smoothed the edge of her glove with methodical precision, and said nothing at all. The emptiness of her response, the refusal to dissolve into tears or apologies, seemed to trouble Prince Adrian in ways his own words had not anticipated. He turned away, and the orchestra, receiving their cue, began to play. The whispers began immediately, not hastily but with the measured inevitability of a social verdict handed down by invisible judges. Clara heard fragments, not because the speakers intended to be kind, but because cruelty in high society operates best when its target is aware of every word. A physician's daughter, no family connection whatsoever. How Mrs. Merrow came to sponsor such a person. His Grace's judgment was remarkably charitable. That final observation stung most acutely, for it reframed the prince's public rejection as an act of mercy rather than condemnation, and in doing so, rendered Clara's position even more pathetic. She was not simply unworthy, she was pitiable even to those obliged to make an example of her. Mrs. Merrow had guided her without comment to a small velvet settee positioned some distance from the dancing. The waltz was underway now, the grand dance that had made the evening's centerpiece, the ritual through which betrothals were suggested and reputations affirmed. Gentlemen led ladies across the floor in a careful embrace, the music swelling and diminishing in that pattern which had for 2 decades represented the heartbeat of English society. The pine green of Clara's dress grew more somber by contrast with the surrounding brilliance. "Why did he say such a thing?" Clara whispered, her voice barely above the level of the orchestra's softest passages. "You are a woman of standing. Your invitation would not have been contested." Mrs. Merrow arranged her plum silk with methodical care before responding. "Because, my dear, Prince Adrian is a man caught between 2 irreconcilable obligations. He is expected to maintain the precise hierarchies upon which his family's authority rests. And he is, beneath that rigid training, a man possessed of certain instincts that trouble those hierarchies considerably." The widow paused, adjusting her spectacles with a gesture that suggested she was about to deliver something of considerable importance. "I suspect his words were less a judgment upon you than a declaration of his own adherence to duty." "I do not understand you, ma'am." "Of course you don't. You are too young to have learned the language in which men of power speak when they wish to protect themselves from their own desires." Mrs. Merrow's eyes, dark and penetrating, fixed upon Clara with the intensity of a woman considering how much truth might be borne by a heart already burdened. "The prince is not unaware of you, Miss Hemsley. On the contrary, I suspect he is acutely aware. His pronouncement was not one of indifference, it was one of defense." Before Clara could formulate a response, the dance concluded. The orchestra released the final notes of the waltz with a ceremonial flourish. The gentlemen led their partners in careful curves back toward the assembled chaperones and observers, and the great ballroom resumed its ordinary rhythms of conversation, refreshment, and the ceaseless calculation of advantage. It was then that Clara became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Not an obvious change, nothing so dramatic as the earlier pronouncement, but rather the sort of atmospheric pressure that precedes a storm. The prince had not, she realized, departed the ballroom, as might have been expected after delivering his judgment. Instead, he remained standing at the entrance, and though he appeared to be conversing with an elderly gentleman of some rank, his attention seemed divided. His gaze, she thought, or perhaps imagined, for the candlelight made such things uncertain, drifted toward the space where she and Mrs. Merrow occupied their settee. "The evening is not finished," Mrs. Merrow murmured, more to herself than to Clara. "In fact, I suspect we are only at the very beginning." A servant passed with a tray of champagne. Clara, whose mouth had become inexplicably dry, accepted a glass with a steady hand that belied the trembling beneath her skin. The liquid was cold, sweet, momentarily soothing. Around her, the ballroom continued its ancient dance of inclusion and exclusion, the music rising and falling like the breath of some vast, judgmental creature. "Why are we still here?" Clara asked finally. "Your carriage surely awaits. We might return to the townhouse, and tomorrow this will begin to fade. In a month, it will be forgotten." "Perhaps," Mrs. Merrow acknowledged, "or perhaps something far more remarkable will occur. I have learned in my years that the most profound transformations often announce themselves through the smallest of gestures, a word spoken in the wrong moment, a hand withheld when it ought to have been extended, a man forced to choose between obedience and integrity at the exact instant when the eyes of the ton are upon him." She did not elaborate further. Instead, she settled back into the settee, her cane resting at an angle that suggested both relaxation and readiness, and waited with the patience of someone accustomed to having her faith vindicated. The orchestra was preparing once more. Clara could hear the musicians conferring, tuning their instruments, arranging themselves for the next piece. It would not be a waltz, she thought. The grand waltz had been danced. What followed would be something less momentous, a quadrille perhaps, or a cotillion. Yet the prince had not moved from his position by the entrance, and his eyes, when they turned toward the space where Clara sat, held an expression that Mrs. Merrow's cryptic words had for the first time made seem plausible, not indifference but something far more complicated. Something that resembled, if one permitted oneself to imagine such a thing, the desperate calculation of a man attempting to decide whether duty or desire held the greater claim upon his soul. The orchestra commenced a quadrille, a dance of measured steps and precise formations, less intimate than the waltz but no less governed by rigid protocol. 4 couples took their positions on the floor, and the music lifted them into its careful geometry. Clara watched with the peculiar detachment that comes from being simultaneously present and utterly excluded, the observer rather than the participant in society's grand performance. Mrs. Merrow had closed her eyes, her head tilted back against the velvet of the settee in a posture that suggested either profound weariness or profound contentment. Clara could not determine which. The widow's fingers, gnarled slightly by age, rested against the ivory handle of her cane with the ease of long familiarity. The quadrille progressed through its figures. The dancers moved with the synchronization of people drilled in protocol from childhood, their movements as predetermined and inviolable as the movement of celestial bodies. Clara found her gaze drifting toward the musicians, toward the violinists, whose bows drew complex harmonies from the air, toward the cellist, whose posture suggested both submission to and command of the instrument, toward the pianist, who operated with the solemnity of one performing rites of considerable spiritual significance. It was in the midst of this observation that she became aware of a new presence. Prince Adrian had moved from his position by the entrance. He now stood at the opposite end of the ballroom, his height allowing him to survey the assembled company, with an expression that had, Clara thought, shifted into something less impersonal. His grey eyes, which had seemed distant and judicial during his pronouncement, now carried a quality of searching, as if he were attempting to locate something amid the assembled masses and finding the search singularly difficult. When those eyes found her, Clara experienced a sensation akin to being struck by light so intense it could not be immediately processed. She turned her face away, suddenly aware of how transparent her own expression might be, how readily her features might betray the confused turbulence of her thoughts. Surely he was not looking at me. Surely the significance I ascribe to his gaze is merely the desperate invention of a wounded heart. Yet she could feel his attention upon her, with the certainty of weight. It was not a comfortable sensation. It was not a comfortable sensation at all. The quadrille approached its conclusion. The musicians were drawing their notes upward in the pattern that signaled the dance's final figures. The dancers moved through their last exchanges with the relief of those approaching the terminus of a lengthy obligation. The gentleman in each couple offered his hand to his lady. The ladies curtsied with varying degrees of grace, and the assembled ballroom responded with the polite applause that courtesy demanded. And then, as the final note trembled into silence, something unprecedented occurred. Prince Adrian stepped forward from his position at the ballroom's periphery. He did not move hastily, but with the deliberate slowness of one making a decision that had cost him considerable internal struggle. His movements parted the assembled company, as surely as Moses parted the sea. Guests shifted away from his path with the instinctive deference of those acknowledging rank. His destination, Clara realized, with a sensation akin to vertigo, was neither ambiguous nor coincidental. He was walking toward the settee upon which she and Mrs. Merrow occupied their appointed place. The ballroom's ambient chatter diminished. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, the ton's antennae becoming alert to the approach of something unexpected. Fans stilled, heads turned with what appeared to be casual interest, but was in reality the focused attention of those trained to interpret every gesture made by those of superior station. Mrs. Merrow's eyes opened. She turned her head with deliberate slowness toward the advancing prince, and something that might have been triumph flickered across her ancient features. The prince came to a halt before the settee. He bowed, a gesture of formal courtesy, but one that carried the weight of deliberation. When he straightened, his eyes found Clara's with the precision of a compass finding north. "The orchestra is preparing the next waltz," Prince Adrian said, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom with the clarity of pronouncement. "I find myself in need of a partner. It occurs to me that a lady whose dance card remains blank might be induced to accept my invitation, should I be so presumptuous as to offer it." The words, when one examined them carefully, were constructed with the precision of a diplomat. They neither contradicted his earlier pronouncement nor explicitly recanted it, yet they contained in their careful architecture something far more significant than mere politeness. They contained, Clara understood with sudden certainty, a deliberate challenge to the very social structures his initial words had seemed to defend. He extended his hand. Behind him, the ton held its collective breath. Mrs. Merrow did something then that Clara would remember for the remainder of her life. She smiled. Not the careful smile of society, but the genuine smile of someone who had anticipated a particular outcome and had the satisfaction of seeing that anticipation vindicated. Clara's fingers trembled as she rose from the settee. She had not been invited to waltz. She had been declared unworthy of the ballroom's spaces. And yet the prince, the highest-ranking man present, the bearer of a name that carried weight across empires, stood with his hand extended toward her, his grey eyes fixed upon hers with an intensity that seemed to deny the possibility of refusal. The music had not yet begun, but she could feel it gathering, the orchestra preparing to recommence, the waltz about to commence. In a moment, Prince Adrian would guide her onto the dancing floor, and every eye in the ballroom would watch the man who had minutes earlier declared her unsuitable for these halls now engage her in the most intimate of social dances, the one that permitted a man to place his hand upon a lady's waist, to hold her in an embrace that was public, yet contained a quality that transcended mere formality. It would be, she understood, a statement that no amount of careful language could obscure. Clara placed her hand in his. The sensation of his hand, firm, steady, warm, despite the December chill that seemed to permeate even the thermally blessed ballroom, transmitted itself through Clara's gloved fingers with the immediacy of certainty. This was not imagination. This was not the desperate fabrication of a wounded heart seeking consolation in fancy. The Prince of Westmarch had, in full view of the assembled ton, claimed her as his partner for the waltz. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that contradicted the absolute authority of the gesture. He drew her upward from the settee with a care that suggested she might be constructed of the most delicate porcelain, fragile and irreplaceable. Mrs. Merrow's cane tapped once against the ballroom's polished floor, a sound that might have been accidental or might have been deliberate approbation, as the prince guided Clara toward the dancing floor. The journey from settee to ballroom center seemed to occur within a suspended moment. The ton parted before them, the ladies and gentlemen of the assembly creating an impromptu pathway that transformed their passage into something akin to a ceremonial procession. Clara was acutely aware of every eye upon her, every gaze calculating the significance of the prince's choice. To her left, she glimpsed Lady Rosamond Vale's expression shift from confusion to something far less manageable, something that resembled wounded pride transmuted into immediate malice. The orchestra had paused. The musicians, alert to every movement within the ballroom's hierarchy, had recognized that something momentous was occurring and waited with the readiness of those trained to respond to the unspoken commands of authority. Prince Adrian conducted them toward the dancing floor with the unconscious command of one accustomed to obedience, and the moment his hand settled upon Clara's waist, that intimate, circumscribed space that waltz permitted and propriety demanded, the musicians recommenced. The opening notes of the waltz rose into the candlelit air like a prayer made audible. "You are trembling," Prince Adrian observed, his voice pitched low enough that only Clara could hear it. His grey eyes held an expression that defied immediate interpretation, something that mingled concern with something far more complex, something that might have been recognition, or might have been apology, or might have been something for which the English language contained no adequate word. "Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice barely audible above the swelling of the violins, "I am not unaware of the significance of this moment. I cannot pretend indifference to the judgment your earlier words conveyed, nor can I fail to understand what your present action communicates to those assembled here. The waltz required them to move, and they did so with the synchronization of dancers who had practiced the steps together for years, rather than encountered one another for the first time mere moments before." His hand at her waist guided her with such precision, such absolute command of the music's rhythm, that Clara found herself moving not in obedience to deliberate intention, but in response to a language more ancient and fundamental than words. The ballroom revolved around them, the candlelight blurring into amber streams, the watching faces becoming indistinct silhouettes, the murmur of the assembled company fading beneath the dominion of the waltz. "I cannot pretend either," Prince Adrian said, "that my words of moments ago were consonant with truth. I spoke them because I believed, or perhaps because I was determined to believe, that doing so was required of me, that a man of my station must police the boundaries of his world with precision, must not permit sentiment to compromise the structures upon which his family's authority depends." They turned together, Clara's pine-green gown creating a subtle swirl of movement that seemed to gather the candlelight rather than reflect it. The prince's charcoal coat appeared nearly black by contrast, yet somehow the darkness of it served to accentuate the steadiness of his gaze, the uncompromising directness of his attention. "And yet," he continued, "I found that once those words had been spoken, once I had attempted to transform my own uncertainty into a sentence of judgment, I could not maintain the posture such certainty required. You stood there, accepting the cruelty with a dignity that rendered my justifications hollow. You did not weep. You did not protest. You simply existed, with a steadiness that made every comfortable certainty I possessed feel suddenly, devastatingly insubstantial." Clara's breath had become shallow. The waltz demanded her attention, demanded the precise positioning of her feet, the subtle adjustments of weight that permitted seamless movement across the floor. Yet beneath that mechanical attention, her heart was engaged in calculations far more complex and perilous. "You should not have said such things," she whispered. "Not publicly, not where others could hear and interpret your words as the pronouncement of law. You have exposed yourself to speculation, Your Grace. There will be those who wonder at the motivation for this reversal." "I am aware," he acknowledged, and something in his tone suggested that the awareness was not unwelcome. "I suspect that within the hour, Lady Rosamond Vale will have circulated no fewer than 5 distinct theories regarding my sudden change of heart. The ton will debate whether I am motivated by perversity, by romantic inclination, or by a desire to prove my independence from their expectations. What matters, Miss Hemsley, is that they will debate it while observing us engaged in the most public of reconciliations." The waltz was approaching its crescendo. The orchestra had gathered all its resources into a final soaring passage of music that seemed to elevate them above the ballroom itself, above the watching faces and whispered accusations, into a realm where only the music and the two of them existed with any substance whatsoever. Prince Adrian drew her slightly closer, a movement minute enough to escape the censure of the most rigorous observers, yet significant enough to transform the nature of the dance into something that transcended mere choreography. "I do not know what future might be possible," he said, and his voice held the tremor of someone speaking dangerous truths aloud for the first time. "I know only that I was coward enough to attempt to deny it, and that cowardice became insupportable the moment I watched you refuse to validate my judgment by accepting it. You belong here, Miss Hemsley, not because society has granted you permission, but because your presence makes everything in this ballroom that is false, that is shallow, that is mere ceremony, seem suddenly, inescapably apparent for what it is." The final note of the waltz trembled into silence. The ballroom erupted. The applause, when it came, held within it a quality of confusion that was almost audible. The assembled guests clapped with the mechanical precision that propriety demanded, yet beneath that courtesy existed a profound uncertainty. What had occurred on the dancing floor was not explicable through the usual categories of social interaction. The prince had not merely danced with an unsuitable companion, he had done so while looking at her in a manner that transcended the bounds of mere gentlemanly attention. Prince Adrian guided Clara from the dancing floor with the same careful deliberation he had employed in drawing her toward it. His hand remained at her elbow, a touch that was entirely proper, yet somehow managed to communicate something far more complicated than propriety. The journey back toward Mrs. Merrow's settee seemed to occur at half the velocity of their approach to the dancing floor, as if they were traversing a far greater distance than the ballroom's actual dimensions would suggest. "You should not remain here," came a voice, pitched low and resonant with something that might have been concern or might have been threat. Prince Adrian and Clara turned to find Lord Ashworth, the evening's host, approaching with an expression of carefully cultivated neutrality. The elderly gentleman's weathered features suggested a lifetime of navigating the treacherous currents of high society. "Your Grace, I do not presume to offer counsel, but there are those already speculating about the implications of your recent attentions. The newspapers, should word reach them, might characterize your behavior in ways that could compromise both your position and that of the lady." Prince Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. When he responded, his voice carried the weight of authority that transcended mere courtesy. "Lord Ashworth, I am aware of the potential consequences of my actions. I am equally aware that a man who permits others to dictate the terms of his own conscience has surrendered everything of value that his station might otherwise provide. Miss Hemsley will remain in this ballroom for the remainder of the evening. I will engage with her as my conscience dictates. Should the newspapers find this matter worthy of their attention, then they shall discover that I am willing to defend my choices before any court of public opinion." The firmness of his tone seemed to settle something in the elderly lord. Ashworth inclined his head with an expression that suggested grudging respect, or perhaps resignation to the inevitable consequences of allowing a man of rank to indulge in moral impulse. He departed with the slowness of one advancing in years, his movement creating a subtle current in the assembled company's awareness. "That was reckless," Mrs. Merrow observed as Clara and the prince arrived at her settee. The widow's dark eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or might have been satisfaction. "Entirely reckless, Your Grace. You have, in the space of a single waltz, transformed your earlier pronouncement from a judgment into a scandal." "A calculated scandal, Mrs. Merrow," the prince replied, and there was the faintest suggestion of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I suspect you have weathered worse in your lifetime. Indeed, I find myself wondering whether your sponsorship of Miss Hemsley was not itself a form of strategic placement, a deliberate positioning of a woman of genuine character into circumstances that would render her exceptional, by contrast with the surrounding mediocrity." "You do me excessive credit, Your Grace," Mrs. Merrow said, "if you imagine my actions were executed with such precision of intention, and yet I confess that I have learned in my years that sometimes the universe aligns itself in service to justice without requiring any conscious direction from those of us operating within its bounds." The orchestra was preparing another dance, not a waltz, Clara noted, with a peculiar sensation of relief and disappointment. The musicians were arranging themselves for a cotillion, that intricate formation dance which required multiple couples and permitted far less intimate connection than the waltz had provided. Around the ballroom, gentlemen were beginning to circulate among the assembled ladies, requesting partnership with the careful courtesy that social obligation demanded. Yet Prince Adrian made no move to depart. He remained standing beside the settee, his hand still resting lightly upon Clara's arm, his presence creating a subtle but unmistakable statement about where his attention and intentions were focused. "Miss Hemsley," he said, "I find myself in an unexpected position. Propriety suggests that I should depart, should permit you to resume the obscurity that my earlier words were intended to enforce. And yet I find that propriety and conscience have entered into direct conflict, and conscience appears to be winning the engagement." Lady Rosamond Vale passed at that precise moment, her crimson gown seeming to vibrate with barely suppressed fury. She fixed Clara with a gaze of such unmistakable malevolence that Mrs. Merrow's grip upon her cane tightened noticeably. Yet before anyone could respond to that silent but eloquent communication, Rosamond had moved beyond them, her movement creating a small but perceptible disturbance in the ballroom's social atmosphere. "There will be consequences," Clara said quietly. "Your actions have made that inevitable. Lady Rosamond will not accept this reversal gracefully, and the ton—" She paused, measuring her words with care. "The ton does not forgive those who violate its expectations, Your Grace. Whatever you have begun tonight, you must be prepared to see it through to whatever conclusion it reaches." Prince Adrian's eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to deny the possibility of misunderstanding. "I am aware of the cost, Miss Hemsley. I have been aware of it from the moment I made the decision to reverse my position. The question now is not whether I am prepared to bear the consequences. The question is whether you are prepared to accept the protection that my position, flawed as it may be, can provide." The remainder of the evening proceeded under the weight of unspoken tension. The cotillion danced without Clara's participation, though this absence seemed to cause considerably less comment than her presence in the prince's arms had generated. Prince Adrian remained at the periphery of Mrs. Merrow's settee, his positioning functioning as both shield and declaration. A gentleman attempting to approach Clara with an invitation to dance encountered the subtle but unmistakable discouragement of the prince's presence and thought better of it. By 11 o'clock, the evening had begun its slow descent toward conclusion. The orchestra had launched into the final musical selections of the night, those quieter, more introspective pieces that signaled an imminent return to the world beyond the ballroom. The Christmas festivities had run their appointed course, and even the most energetic dancers were beginning to surrender to fatigue. "We must depart soon," Mrs. Merrow announced, her weathered voice carrying the certainty of one accustomed to dictating the terms of her own existence. "The hour grows late, and my health does not permit excessive exertion." "Then permit me to escort you both to your carriage," Prince Adrian said, and it was not a request, but a statement of intent. "The evening air is bracing, but not so cold as to be entirely unmanageable." The journey through Ashworth House proceeded under a veil of awareness that transcended the ordinary. Servants moved aside with the instinctive deference of those trained to recognize rank. Other guests, recognizing the nature of the procession, made subtle adjustments to permit the prince unobstructed passage. The entire choreography of departure seemed to communicate to everyone present that something fundamental had shifted in the evening's social calculus. Outside, the December night held the crystalline clarity of approaching frost. The street lamps cast their amber light across the pavement, and the hired carriages waited in orderly rows, their horses stamping occasionally against the cold. Mrs. Merrow's conveyance bore the discreet coat of arms that identified her family lineage, and it was positioned with the consideration that rank automatically conferred. Prince Adrian handed Mrs. Merrow into the carriage first, a gesture of respect that seemed to please the elderly widow considerably. As Clara stepped toward the carriage's interior, the prince extended his hand, that same hand that had guided her through the waltz, that had rested at her waist as the music swelled around them. "You will permit me to call upon Mrs. Merrow tomorrow afternoon," he said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a question, but rather a statement of intention. "I suspect there are matters that require discussion, and I find that candlelight and orchestral accompaniment are not optimal conditions for the articulation of serious intent." Clara's fingers trembled as she placed them in his grasp. "Your Grace, I must warn you that there will be scandal, that society will gossip, that my family may express displeasure." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Miss Hemsley, I have spent my entire life in obedience to others' expectations. I have conducted myself with precision, with propriety, with the absolute adherence to duty that my station demands. And in doing so, I discovered that I had cultivated a life of profound emptiness. Tonight, I chose differently, and though I cannot promise what tomorrow will bring, I can promise that I am no longer willing to ignore the voice of my own conscience simply because doing so is convenient." "You should know," Clara whispered, "that whatever you believe you feel, you may discover upon reflection that the candlelight and music created an illusion. Men of your station often mistake the drama of a moment for something more substantial." "You are not entirely wrong," he acknowledged. "Men are indeed susceptible to such misinterpretations, yet I suspect, Miss Hemsley, that you will discover something that may prove equally troubling, that what occurred between us tonight transcends the categories of illusion or dramatic impulse. It is something far more real and far more consequential than either of us is yet prepared to acknowledge." He released her hand with deliberate slowness, and Clara stepped into the carriage's interior. As the door closed and the conveyance began its journey through the December streets, she found herself unable to prevent a final backward glance. Prince Adrian stood upon the pavement, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight, watching the carriage depart with the expression of a man witnessing something precious slip beyond his grasp, even as he remained perfectly, absolutely still. Mrs. Merrow, her ancient eyes fixed upon Clara's face, wore the expression of someone whose calculations had been entirely vindicated. "I warned you," the widow said softly, "that some truths only emerge when the room falls silent. It appears, Miss Hemsley, that you have just encountered one." The townhouse on Belgrave Square returned to silence once the carriage had discharged its passengers. The servants, sensing the peculiar quality of the evening's disturbance, moved with greater discretion than usual, their footsteps muted upon the marble floors, their voices reduced to whispered necessities. Clara ascended the staircase to her modest chamber on the 3rd floor with the sensation of moving through water, each step requiring conscious intention, her mind occupied with the methodical processing of events that defied rational explanation. The chamber itself was small, appointed with the careful simplicity that accompanied her position as companion rather than family. A single window overlooked the street below. Candlelight from the street lamps created patterns of amber and shadow upon the pale walls. Clara lit the fire that had been laid in readiness, and as the flames caught and rose, she found herself examining her own reflection in the glass above the mantelpiece. She scarcely recognized the woman who gazed back at her. The exertion of the evening had brought color to her cheeks. Her hazel eyes held a luminosity that suggested fever rather than health. Her pine-green gown, when she finally removed it with the assistance of the chambermaid, bore the faint scent of beeswax and the prince's cologne, a fragrance that lingered with troubling persistence. Sleep proved impossible. Clara lay in darkness, her mind replaying the events of the evening with the obsessive precision of one attempting to locate error in a mathematical calculation. She examined the prince's words for signs of insincerity, searched his expressions for evidence of casual manipulation, attempted to construct narratives in which his behavior could be attributed to anything other than what his actions had seemed to communicate. Yet every examination yielded the same result. Prince Adrian of Westmarch had deliberately contradicted his own public judgment, had claimed her hand for the waltz, and had declared his intention to call upon Mrs. Merrow's household on the following afternoon. Morning arrived with grey inevitability. The December sun, weak and distant, provided illumination that seemed insufficient to the task of managing the complexities of daylight. Clara dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of pale grey wool trimmed with white lace, a choice that reflected neither the boldness of pine green nor the excessive elegance of the evening's festive garments. It was a gown of transition, of uncertainty, of a woman suspended between distinct states of existence. Mrs. Merrow received her in the morning room, where a fire crackled with determined liveliness, and the December light struggled through tall windows. The widow had evidently slept with greater success than Clara. Her ancient features possessed their customary sharpness, and her dark eyes glittered with an expression that suggested she had spent the night engaged in strategic calculation. "You have not rested," Mrs. Merrow observed, gesturing Clara toward the chair opposite her own. "Your pallor suggests a night spent in the company of anxious reflection rather than the arms of Morpheus." "I could not achieve a state conducive to sleep," Clara admitted. "The events of the evening seem to resist simple categorization. I remain uncertain whether what occurred was genuine or whether the artifice of music and candlelight created an illusion that seemed more substantial than reality could sustain." "A reasonable concern," Mrs. Merrow acknowledged, accepting a cup of tea from the servant who had entered with a laden tray. "Though I would suggest that you are confusing two distinct phenomena. Yes, music and candlelight possess the capacity to elevate emotion and distort judgment. Yet they do not possess the capacity to create feelings where none existed previously. They merely render visible those sentiments that were already present, but concealed beneath the ordinary layers of social constraint." Before Clara could formulate a response, the butler entered with an expression of careful neutrality. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Mrs. Merrow with the deference that her station commanded, "there is a visitor, a gentleman of considerable rank. I have taken the liberty of placing him in the front parlour, but I am uncertain whether—" "Does the gentleman possess a title?" Mrs. Merrow interrupted, her eyes glinting with something that might have been amusement. "Indeed, ma'am, His Grace, the Prince of Westmarch." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara's cup of tea slipped from her grasp and shattered upon the carpet, the liquid spreading in a pattern that resembled a tea-leaf reader's prophecy of chaos. Mrs. Merrow did not move, yet her expression shifted into something that transcended mere satisfaction and approached profound vindication. "Show His Grace to the drawing-room," the widow commanded, "and ensure that refreshments are offered." When one receives a visitor of such elevated station at an hour when courtesy demands surprise rather than expectation, one must exert oneself to provide appropriate hospitality. Clara rose from her chair with the sensation of rising through water. "Mrs. Merrow, this is impossible. A man of his position cannot call upon a house at such an hour, and certainly not upon a woman of my status. The scandal will be considerable." Mrs. Merrow agreed placidly, rising with the aid of her cane and beginning a slow progression toward the drawing-room, "which is precisely why he has done it. A man does not risk scandal unless what he seeks is worth the cost. Come, Miss Hemsley, let us discover what Prince Adrian of Westmarch intends to communicate in daylight, unadorned by the theatrical accompaniments that the ballroom so generously provided." The drawing-room was appointed in the manner of houses inhabited by the elderly and wealthy, furniture of substantial construction, paintings that suggested generations of careful acquisition, colors that evoked stability and tradition rather than fashion. Prince Adrian stood before the fireplace, his dark hair appearing nearly black in the morning light, his charcoal coat bearing the precise tailoring that wealth and station combined to provide. He turned at the sound of their entrance, and his grey eyes found Clara's with the directness of someone for whom social niceties had temporarily ceased to possess significance. "Mrs. Merrow," he said, offering the widow a bow of extraordinary courtesy, "I trust you will permit me to explain the impropriety of this hour's visit. I am aware that convention would suggest a later time, yet I found that awaiting the appointed afternoon hours, while nursing uncertainty regarding the implications of last evening's events, proved intolerable." "I suspect, Your Grace," Mrs. Merrow replied, settling into a chair with deliberate slowness, "that convention has already been sufficiently breached by your actions at last evening's entertainment. One further violation in the pursuit of clarity seems almost negligible by comparison. Please do sit. You appear to possess something of considerable importance to communicate, and I find that significant conversations proceed with greater ease when all participants are disposed in positions of reasonable comfort." Prince Adrian remained standing, his posture suggesting that what he intended to articulate demanded the formality that erect bearing provided. His hand unconsciously aligned the edge of his cuff, that gesture of subtle agitation that Clara had begun to recognize as evidence of internal struggle. "Last evening," he commenced, his voice measured despite the evident tension beneath its surface, "I committed an act that I have spent the night attempting to justify through the application of reason, propriety, and every rationale that my position might offer. I failed utterly in that endeavor. No amount of intellectual exercise could transform an action fundamentally at odds with duty into something that duty could accommodate. And yet," Mrs. Merrow observed, "you appear to have survived the night without collapsing beneath the weight of moral culpability." A shadow of a smile touched the prince's features. "I have learned to live with contradictions, Mrs. Merrow. One cannot exist in my position without developing a tolerance for irreconcilable tensions. Yet last evening's contradiction was of a particularly acute nature. I found myself defending the very boundaries I had moments earlier violated. I claimed to honor propriety whilst simultaneously transgressing every boundary that propriety establishes." Clara remained silent, her attention fixed upon the space between herself and the prince, that interval which seemed simultaneously impossibly vast and utterly negligible. "What troubles me most," Prince Adrian continued, "is that I cannot bring myself to regret my actions. A man of integrity, one might argue, would either behave with absolute propriety or would accept the moral consequences of impropriety. Yet I find myself in the peculiar position of having acted improperly while simultaneously believing that the action itself was morally necessary." "You are troubled, Your Grace," Mrs. Merrow said, "by the discovery that morality and propriety do not necessarily occupy the same space. This is, I confess, a more common realization than most people of your station are prepared to acknowledge. Yet it is, I suspect, a realization that possesses considerable value." Prince Adrian turned to face Clara directly. When he spoke, his voice had shed the formality of address and had become something far more intimate, far more dangerous in its earnestness. "Miss Hemsley, I am aware that my presence here creates difficulty for you. Society will interpret this visit according to the most sensational narratives available to it. There are those who will claim I have come to pursue an improper attachment. Others will insist that the prince is engaged in some form of elaborate jest. I cannot prevent such interpretations. What I can do is speak with absolute clarity regarding my own intentions." He paused, and in that pause Clara became aware that she was holding her breath, had perhaps been holding it since the moment the butler had announced his arrival. "I am not a man given to hasty decisions," Prince Adrian said. "I am accustomed to contemplating actions from multiple angles, to considering the consequences that my choices might create for those dependent upon my judgment. Yet there are moments when contemplation becomes a form of cowardice, when the refusal to act in accordance with one's conscience becomes more morally culpable than any action could ever be." He took a step closer, though his movements remained within the bounds of formal propriety. "I have considered throughout the night what my actions should communicate. I have concluded that ambiguity is intolerable. Therefore I am here to state clearly, in the presence of your patroness and of a morning that permits no escape into the shadows of candlelight. Miss Hemsley, I find myself in a position I had not anticipated and cannot easily reconcile. The question I must ask is whether you believe it possible that what occurred between us last evening was founded upon something more substantial than the ephemeral emotions that music and dance might temporarily inspire." Mrs. Merrow's grip on her cane had tightened noticeably. The widow's ancient eyes shifted from the prince to Clara, with the expression of someone observing a drama whose outcome she could not entirely predict, despite her considerable experience. Clara found that her voice, when she attempted speech, emerged as scarcely more than a whisper. "Your Grace, I must be honest with you. I am uncertain whether what I felt last evening was genuine affection, or whether it was the natural response of a woman made suddenly visible after hours of invisibility. You have elevated me from rejection to acceptance in the span of a single waltz. Such transformation cannot be processed and understood in the space of a single night. I ask nothing of you at this moment," Prince Adrian replied, "except that you acknowledge the possibility that we might discover something of value if we permitted ourselves the time and privacy to understand what occurred. I am not asking you to commit yourself to any course of action. I am asking only that you permit me to call upon you, to speak with you beyond the constraints of ballroom protocol, to offer you the opportunity to know me as something other than a man bound by the expectations of his station." "Your Grace," Mrs. Merrow interjected, her voice carrying an undertone of warning, "such actions will provoke considerable comment. There are those in society who will interpret your intentions in the most unflattering manner possible." "I am aware," the prince acknowledged. "I am equally aware that protecting Miss Hemsley from speculation by maintaining distance would be an act of supreme cowardice. Whatever judgment society renders, she will face it far more effectively at my side than she would as a woman who had been claimed publicly and then abandoned privately." The carriage bearing Prince Adrian departed from Belgrave Square at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, thus permitting the morning hours to pass without the most egregious violation of social convention. Yet even this concession to propriety proved insufficient to prevent speculation. Within hours the news had circulated through the drawing rooms and morning assemblies of high society with the velocity of scandal pursued by those who thrived upon its dissemination. By evening, there existed at least 7 distinct theories regarding the prince's visit. The prince had come to correct some slight he had committed against Mrs. Merrow, a theory that collapsed immediately under examination, for no prior relationship between them was known. The prince had come to attempt to reduce Clara to tears and thus humiliate her further, a theory that required considerable willful suspension of disbelief. The prince had developed a romantic interest in Mrs. Merrow herself and had visited the widow to court her, a theory that dissolved under the weight of absurdity. The prince was engaged in some form of elaborate moral instruction, attempting to demonstrate to society the consequences of rejecting unsuitable women, a theory that granted him a generosity of intention that few observers seemed inclined to extend. The prince had lost his mind entirely and was operating without the knowledge or consent of his family, a theory that possessed considerable appeal for those who found comfort in the explanation of aberrant behavior through mental incapacity. The prince had developed genuine romantic inclination toward Clara Hemsley, a theory that most observers dismissed as both impossible and socially catastrophic. Clara remained largely unaware of these circulating speculations, for Mrs. Merrow had, with characteristic decisiveness, forbidden the servants to repeat gossip, and had instituted a policy of isolating the household from the morning callers who suddenly discovered urgent business in the vicinity of Belgrave Square. "Let them theorize," Mrs. Merrow declared with satisfaction as she examined her correspondence on the morning following the prince's visit. "Speculation is far preferable to indifference, and the fact that they find his behavior sufficiently remarkable to discuss at length suggests that something genuinely unexpected has occurred." Yet Clara could not quite match the widow's equanimity. She found herself moving through the household's daily routines with the sensation of operating beneath water, her attention perpetually divided between present circumstances and anxious anticipation of what Prince Adrian's intentions might ultimately prove to be. The prince had said that he would call again, that he would ask for permission to spend time in her company beyond the constraints of ballroom protocol. Yet such permissions, when they involved a prince and a woman of Clara's station, were not granted without considerable difficulty. It was on the afternoon of the third day following the Christmas ball that the letter arrived. Mrs. Merrow placed it in Clara's hands personally, her ancient features arranged in an expression of careful neutrality that did nothing to conceal her evident satisfaction. The envelope bore the prince's personal seal, a crest of considerable intricacy, and the weight of the paper suggested that this was no casual correspondence. "You will read it in your chamber," Mrs. Merrow instructed, "and you will consider carefully what response, if any, seems appropriate." Clara ascended to her small room with trembling hands. The letter, when she finally gathered sufficient courage to open it, was written in a hand that suggested both care in composition and haste in execution. The message itself was brief, yet it conveyed a weight of intention that rendered length unnecessary. "Miss Hemsley, I find that the ordinary conventions of social interaction prove inadequate to the circumstances in which I find myself. Therefore, I'm taking the liberty of addressing you through written means, a form of communication that permits clarity without the complications that immediate response might create. The tongue interprets my actions according to the most sensational narratives available to them. I suspect they will continue to do so regardless of what I might say or do. What matters to me is not their interpretation, but your own assessment of my intentions. I am not a man prone to romantic impulse. I am by nature and training cautious, deliberate, and inclined toward the protection of my family's reputation above all other considerations. Yet I have concluded that living beneath the weight of such caution has cost me everything of genuine value that my life might have contained. I propose a solution that runs counter to propriety whilst remaining within the bounds of technical correctness. I would ask Mrs. Merrow's permission to escort you on daily constitutionals through the park. These walks would occur in daylight, in public spaces, and would thus remain beyond reproach, whilst simultaneously providing us with the opportunity to speak freely regarding matters that cannot be adequately addressed in the presence of chaperones listening for impropriety. Should you find such an arrangement acceptable, please indicate your consent to Mrs. Merrow. I will call for you tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. Yours in service and uncertain hope. Adrian. Clara read the letter 3 times before permitting herself to acknowledge that her hands were trembling. The prince had not written Prince Adrian, but merely Adrian, a familiarity that transcended the bounds of formal address, that suggested intimacy not yet earned but earnestly sought. She descended to Mrs. Merrow's drawing room with the letter still clutched in her hands. "Well?" the widow asked, without preamble. "What does the incorrigible man propose?" "Daily walks in the park," Clara replied, her voice steadier than she would have believed possible. "With you as chaperone, ostensibly, though I suspect his actual intention is to ensure that we have opportunity for conversation beyond the constraints of formal society." Mrs. Merrow smiled, a genuine smile, unguarded and utterly satisfied. "Then you will accept," the widow said. It was not a question. "Because you have learned, as I suspected you would, that some truths are worth the risk they demand." The first constitutional through Hyde Park occurred under skies of pewter grey, the December afternoon lending itself to contemplation rather than frivolity. Prince Adrian arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, dressed with the careful formality that propriety demanded, yet his grey eyes held an expression of such unmistakable intensity that Clara found herself wondering whether any amount of conventional correctness could truly conceal the truth of his intentions. Mrs. Merrow, ensconced in her carriage at a discreet distance, permitted them to walk ahead whilst maintaining the technical appearance of supervision. The arrangement was, as the prince had calculated, technically correct, whilst simultaneously permitting conversation of considerably greater intimacy than ballroom protocol would ever allow. "You accepted my proposal," Adrian said, as they moved along the gravel pathway beneath the bare branches of London's most fashionable trees. "I confess, I experienced considerable uncertainty regarding whether you might regard my written words as an inappropriate presumption. I regarded them as evidence that you are willing to risk scandal in pursuit of clarity," Clara replied, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear it. "Though I remain uncertain whether clarity is what you will discover, or whether you will instead encounter a woman far less remarkable than candlelight and music suggested. The woman I encountered at the Christmas ball did not require candlelight to be remarkable," Adrian said. "She required only the courage to endure humiliation without surrendering her dignity. That quality, I assure you, loses nothing in daylight." They walked in companionable silence for some moments, their footsteps synchronized against the gravel. Around them, London continued its ordinary existence. Other couples promenading, servants accompanying children, the machinery of society grinding forward with its customary indifference to the interior transformations occurring within individual hearts. "I must tell you," Clara said eventually, "that Lady Rosamond has begun a campaign of extraordinary subtlety. She no longer attacks me directly. Instead, she circulates stories regarding my origins, regarding the supposed impropriety of my relationship with Mrs. Merrow, regarding any detail that might render my presence in your company appear either contemptible or scandalous." "I am aware," Adrian replied, and something in his tone suggested that such opposition was neither unexpected nor particularly troubling. "The ton functions through gossip and speculation. What you describe is merely the inevitable consequence of my actions. The question is not whether Lady Rosamond will attempt to damage your reputation, but whether you are prepared to weather such damage in the company of someone whose name carries sufficient weight to counterbalance any calumny she might generate." They had reached a small arbor, leafless and windswept, offering a degree of privacy that the open pathways did not provide. Adrian drew her gently into its shelter, and Clara found herself suddenly aware of how completely she was removed from the eyes of the ton, how utterly dependent upon his honor and restraint she had become. "You are trembling again," he observed, his fingers reaching to adjust her shawl with a tenderness that suggested great care. "Is it the cold, or is it uncertainty regarding my intentions?" "Both," Clara admitted. "Your Grace, Adrian, I must be honest. What you are offering appears to be romantic attention, perhaps even the possibility of something more permanent. Yet such attachments between men of your station and women of mine inevitably end in compromise or scandal. I cannot ask you to sacrifice your position for sentiments that the morning light will almost certainly render untenable." "Do you love me?" Adrian asked, the question posed with such directness that it seemed to disarm all possibility of evasion. "I do not know you sufficiently well to love you," Clara replied carefully. "What I feel is gratitude, admiration for your courage, and a dangerous susceptibility to the romantic narrative that recent events have constructed. Love, true love, requires knowledge and time and the stripping away of every theatrical accompaniment." "Then we shall pursue all three," Adrian declared. "I will call upon you every afternoon. We will converse about matters that extend far beyond the boundaries of social pleasantry, and when you have achieved sufficient knowledge of my character, sufficient understanding of my intentions, you will recognize that what I feel for you transcends the ephemeral emotions that even the most theatrical of circumstances might create." He reached for her hand, and Clara allowed him to take it. The sensation of his fingers closing around hers transmitted itself through her gloved palm, with the certainty of something real, something substantial, something that could not be dismissed as the temporary elevation of emotion that candlelight and music might provide. "There will be consequences," Clara whispered, "for both of us." "I am aware," Adrian replied. "I am equally determined to face them. The only question that remains is whether you are prepared to face them at my side." December transformed into January, with the relentless forward motion of seasons that acknowledge no human sentiment. The daily walks continued, expanding from constitutional to longer expeditions through London's less fashionable districts, where observation attracted less attention and conversation could proceed without the constant awareness of being monitored by those trained to interpret every gesture. Yet the scandal, rather than diminishing, had begun to intensify. By the middle of January, the situation had reached a critical juncture. Prince Adrian's family had made their displeasure unmistakably clear through a series of carefully worded letters that Mrs. Merrow had permitted Clara to read. The king himself, it was rumoured, had expressed concerns regarding the prince's judgment. Pressure was being exerted through channels both official and subtle, all directed toward compelling Adrian to cease his attentions and restore the proper order of society. It was during the 17 Constitutional that the crisis reached its apotheosis. They were walking through the gardens at Kensington when Adrian drew Clara aside into the shelter of a small pavilion. His expression carried a gravity that transcended anything she had previously witnessed, and his hand, when it reached for hers, trembled slightly, evidence that his composure, however carefully maintained, concealed considerable internal turmoil. "I have received an ultimatum from my family," he said without preamble. "They have made clear that my continued pursuit of you will result in significant consequences. My annual allowance will be reduced. My position at court will be rendered untenable. I will be effectively cast into a state of social isolation that will make my current situation appear positively enviable." Clara's breath caught. "Then you must cease," she said immediately. "Adrian, I cannot ask you to sacrifice everything for sentiments that—" "That what?" he interrupted, his grey eyes blazing with an intensity that transcended propriety. "That might prove temporary, that might not survive the mundane reality of ordinary life. Clara, I'm aware of those possibilities. I have contemplated them extensively, and I have concluded that the alternative, the choice to preserve my position by surrendering you, is far more intolerable than any consequence my family's displeasure might generate." "You cannot make such a decision," Clara protested. "Your duty—" "My duty," Adrian declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "is not to preserve an inheritance or to maintain a position that has become synonymous with moral cowardice. My duty is to honor the truth of my own heart, and that truth is this. I love you, Clara Hemsley, not because candlelight rendered you remarkable, not because music elevated your presence into something transcendent, but because in the space of weeks you have become the center around which all other considerations orbit." He drew a small velvet box from his coat pocket and sank to one knee upon the pavilion's stone floor. "I am aware that this action violates every protocol that custom demands. I am aware that a proper proposal would occur in daylight, with witnesses, with all the ceremonial accompaniments that society requires. Yet I find that I can no longer endure the performance of propriety when truth demands articulation." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not the ostentatious display of jewels that society might have expected, but rather a circlet of white gold bearing a single sapphire, a stone of such profound blue that it appeared to contain entire skies within its depths. "Clara Hemsley, will you marry me? Not because society demands it, not because it will resolve the scandal that my actions have created, but because you have discovered in yourself the capacity to see past the exterior that my station provides, and because I have discovered in you the singular quality that all my years of privilege had taught me to despair of ever encountering: genuine, uncompromising moral courage." The silence that followed seemed to extend beyond the bounds of ordinary time. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes, not tears of joy, but tears of profound recognition, tears that acknowledged the magnitude of what he was offering and the cost it would inevitably demand. "I will," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Adrian, I will marry you, though I fear what such a choice will mean for both of us." "Fear is appropriate," Adrian replied, rising and sliding the ring upon her finger. "But it will not be sufficient to prevent me from claiming you as my wife before whatever witnesses the universe provides, and declaring to every force, social, familial, or otherwise, that your dignity is worth infinitely more than any inheritance they might threaten to withhold." He drew her into an embrace that transcended the bounds of propriety, and as his lips found hers, Clara understood that the transformation begun at the Christmas ball had reached its final, irrevocable stage. They were no longer playing roles. They were no longer navigating the careful choreography of social interaction. They had, in that moment, become something far more genuine, far more terrifying, and infinitely more valuable than society could ever acknowledge. Epilogue. The chapel of Ashworth House had been transformed for the occasion, though not in the manner that society might have anticipated. There were no elaborate floral arrangements, no ostentatious displays of wealth designed to demonstrate the resources that rank provided. Instead, the chapel bore the marks of simplicity: white candles arranged along the altar, garlands of evergreen that suggested renewal rather than excess, and an atmosphere of profound quiet that seemed to acknowledge the magnitude of what was about to occur. It was late January, nearly 2 months after the Christmas ball that had initiated this extraordinary sequence of events. The ton had split along predictable lines. Those who viewed Adrian's actions as a commendable assertion of personal integrity against the tyranny of social convention, and those who regarded them as a catastrophic violation of duty that would have consequences reverberating through generations. The king, after considerable deliberation, had chosen a middle path, neither granting explicit approval nor issuing outright condemnation. Adrian's allowance had been reduced, his position at court rendered ceremonial rather than substantive, his family's public acknowledgement of him diminished to the bare minimum that propriety required. Yet he was not, technically, cast out. The doors remained open, albeit barely. Mrs. Merrow occupied the front pew, her ancient frame wrapped in layers of pale grey silk, her dark eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of one who had orchestrated events toward their inevitable conclusion. She had confessed to Clara during the preparations, anticipated this outcome from the moment she had first observed the prince's face during that fateful Christmas ball. "A man," she had said, "who betrays himself through a single glance is already lost to propriety." It was merely a matter of waiting for him to recognize the nature of his own chains. The organ commenced its solemn prelude. The assembled guests, a modest assembly compared to the ballroom crowds that had witnessed the earlier drama, rose in acknowledgement of the ritual about to unfold. There were dignitaries present, family members whose attendance suggested varying degrees of acceptance or resignation, and those few individuals who had recognized in Adrian's choice an authenticity that transcended the ordinary calculations of advantage and disadvantage. Clara appeared at the chapel's entrance, accompanied by a gentleman of considerable age and respectability, the elderly physician who had been her father's colleague, a man of modest means but genuine character. He had been invited to fulfill the role that ordinarily would have fallen to a father, and he approached the task with the gravity of one honored by the responsibility. Her gown was white, as tradition demanded, but it bore none of the elaborate ornamentation that the ton's expectations would have required. The lace was simple, the cut elegant but not ostentatious, and the veil that crowned her hair suggested both bride and woman in equal measure. She carried no elaborate bouquet, but rather a single branch of evergreen tied with white ribbon, a symbol of constancy, of endurance, of the capacity to flourish even beneath winter's harshest conditions. As she moved down the chapel's aisle, Clara became aware that the true meaning of the moment transcended the ceremonial elements that surrounded it. This was not merely a wedding in the conventional sense. This was a public declaration that a man of rank and privilege had chosen to elevate a woman of modest origins above the claims of society, above the demands of family obligation, above the expectations that his position ordinarily required him to fulfill. Adrian waited at the altar in dress uniform, bearing the insignia of his rank, a choice that seemed deliberately calculated to underscore the paradox of his action. He wore the symbols of his privilege, even as he was actively sacrificing the advantages that privilege provided. His grey eyes, when they found hers, held an expression of such profound tenderness that several of the assembled guests found themselves obliged to employ handkerchiefs with considerable discretion. The ceremony proceeded with the formality that tradition demanded. The vicar, an elderly gentleman of evident piety, conducted the proceedings with a solemnity that seemed to acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances that had precipitated this union. When he reached the moment of vows, Adrian's voice rang through the chapel with absolute clarity as he declared his commitment, not merely to the woman before him, but to the choice that such commitment represented. "I take thee, Clara Hemsley, to be my wife," Adrian pronounced, his words carrying a weight that transcended mere legal declaration. "Not because society demands it, not because my family approves it, but because you have taught me that honor and integrity are not preserved through obedience to external constraints, but rather through fidelity to the truth that resides within one's own conscience. With this ring I seal my vow before God, before this assembly, and before the deepest truth of my own heart." Clara's hand trembled as she accepted the ring, that same sapphire that he had offered in the pavilion, now accompanied by a band of white gold that suggested permanence and completion. When she spoke her own vows, her voice carried the quiet dignity that had first attracted his attention at the Christmas ball, that quality of uncompromising steadfastness that no amount of adversity could diminish. "I take thee, Adrian," she said, and her eyes held his with absolute conviction, "to be my husband." not because it elevates my station or secures my future, though I confess both of those considerations possess their own appeal, but because you have demonstrated that true nobility resides not in the accident of birth, but in the courage to choose integrity over convenience. With this ring, I seal my commitment to walk beside you, to face whatever consequences our choice generates, and to build a life founded upon something far more substantial than society's approval or fortune's favor. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife with evident emotion, as if recognizing in this union something that transcended the ordinary calculations of advantage and disadvantage. When Adrian drew Clara into an embrace, the chapel erupted in applause, not the carefully modulated applause of social convention, but rather the genuine expression of those who had witnessed something authentically transformative. As they turned to face the assembled guests, Clara became aware that the light streaming through the chapel's tall windows had intensified, transforming the space into something luminous and transcendent. The evergreen that adorned the altar released its subtle fragrance into the air, and in that moment she understood that Mrs. Merrow's cryptic observations had been vindicated in the most profound manner possible. Some truths, indeed, only emerged when the room fell silent. And in the space created by that silence, when music gave way to authenticity and performance surrendered to genuine emotion, even the most cynical observers were obliged to acknowledge the presence of something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of social calculation. They had not conquered society. The consequences of their choice would reverberate through their lives indefinitely. There would be doors closed to them, invitations withdrawn, the subtle and not-so-subtle forms of ostracism that high society employed against those who violated its fundamental principles. Yet as Adrian led Clara back down the chapel's aisle, his hand never releasing hers, as Mrs. Merrow rose from her pew with the satisfied expression of one whose calculations had been entirely vindicated, Clara understood something that no amount of prior experience could have taught her, that there existed a form of belonging infinitely more valuable than the acceptance of a society constructed upon hierarchy and exclusion. She belonged to someone who had chosen her freely, who had sacrificed everything that society ordinarily valued in order to claim her at his side. And that belonging, secured not through inherited position but through deliberate moral choice, was worth every consequence that the future might generate. Outside the chapel, the January afternoon had transformed itself into something approaching beauty. The snow had begun to fall, gentle and persistent, transforming London's streets into a landscape of possibility. As Adrian and Clara emerged into that snowy silence hand in hand, the assembled guests witnessed a sight that would be recounted for decades: a prince and a woman of modest origins, moving forward together into a future that no amount of social convention could define or diminish. The waltz at the Christmas ball had changed everything. But this moment of public declaration, of ritual completion, of two individuals choosing each other before God and witnesses, this was the true transformation. Mrs. Merrow, observing their departure from the chapel steps, permitted herself a single satisfied smile. She had, she reflected, always possessed an instinct for recognizing those rare individuals capable of transcending the ordinary boundaries of their circumstances. And in Adrian and Clara, she had witnessed not merely a romantic union, but rather a testament to the possibility of moral courage, triumphant over the suffocating constraints of social expectation. As their carriage moved away through the snow-covered streets of London, Clara turned to Adrian with the expression of someone who had finally, irrevocably, come home. "Are you afraid?" he asked, perceiving the emotion that flickered across her features. "Terrified," she admitted, "but no longer uncertain." "That," Adrian replied, drawing her close as the carriage swayed along the familiar routes of the city, "is precisely what I required to hear. In the depths of winter's cold certainty, when hierarchies stand as immovable as marble, and belonging appears granted only through the accidents of birth, there emerges a singular and transformative truth, that genuine dignity cannot be bestowed by society, nor can it be withheld by those who fear its power. The cruelest prisons are not those constructed of iron and stone, but rather those built from the collective expectations of those we regard as our betters. We accept their judgments as law, their hierarchies as natural order, their exclusions as justice. And in accepting these fictions, we surrender the most precious gift that existence offers, the authority to determine our own worth through the authenticity of our own choices. Yet there exists within the human spirit a capacity for rebellion, that transcends reason, that defies explanation, that emerges most powerfully at the moment when we are forced to choose between obedience and integrity. Prince Adrian possessed everything that society deems valuable: rank, wealth, privilege, the inherited authority to determine the experiences of others. Yet he discovered that all of these possessions were infinitely less valuable than the singular opportunity to choose his own truth, even at tremendous cost. Clara Hemsley possessed nothing that society valued, yet she possessed the one quality that cannot be manufactured or purchased or inherited: the uncompromising dignity that emerges when one refuses to accept another's judgment as the final truth of one's own worth. Their union teaches us something profoundly necessary: that the greatest act of courage is not the defiance of external authority, but rather the recognition that true authority resides nowhere but within the authenticity of our own hearts. When we surrender that internal authority to external judgment, we become servants to systems that were never designed to serve our genuine flourishing. The ton continues, as it always does, governed by rules that perpetually shift, yet somehow remain eternally immovable. But on the periphery of that elaborate game, there exists the possibility of something far more valuable than membership in the circles of the powerful, the possibility of building a life founded upon the terrifying, exhilarating truth that we ourselves are the ultimate arbiters of our own dignity. This is the lesson that winter teaches those willing to listen, that the harshest seasons produce not merely survival, but transformation, that the most profound acts of courage often emerge in moments of greatest vulnerability, and that belonging is never something granted by external forces, but rather something created through the deliberate choice to stand beside another human being, to see them as they truly are, and to declare that truth before all opposing voices. Dear beloved listeners of Victorian Romance audio stories, we hope that the journey of Clara and Adrian has touched your hearts as profoundly as it touched ours in the crafting of their tale. Their story reminds us that true romance transcends the boundaries of propriety, that genuine love demands moral courage, and that belonging is something we create rather than something we receive. We invite you to become part of our growing community of those who believe in the transformative power of authentic storytelling. If Clara's quiet dignity and Adrian's courageous integrity have resonated within your soul, if you have found yourself moved by their journey from rejection to radical acceptance, we urge you to subscribe to Victorian Romance audio stories and ensure that no tale of moral courage, no story of love triumphing against impossible odds, ever passes beyond your awareness. Each week, we bring you new narratives of women and men navigating the complex terrain between duty and desire, between social expectation and authentic truth. Leave a comment sharing which moment in this story touched your heart most deeply. Was it the Christmas ball and that transformative waltz? Was it the daily constitutional through Hyde Park? Was it the moment when Adrian knelt in the pavilion and declared his love with absolute honesty? Your reflections matter, for they become part of the ongoing conversation about what it means to choose integrity over comfort, authenticity over acceptance. Share this story with those in your life who have also struggled against the suffocating constraints of others' expectations, who have wondered whether it is possible to build a life founded upon personal truth rather than external validation, who have yearned for someone to see them truly and choose them freely. Together we are building a community of those who understand that the most powerful stories are not those that merely entertain, but those that transform, that illuminate the possibility of moral courage, that remind us that we need not accept the judgments that society imposes upon us. Thank you, dear listeners, for dedicating nearly 2 hours of your precious time to the journey of Clara Hemsley and Prince Adrian of Westmarch. Thank you for permitting us to escort you through the gaslit ballrooms of Victorian society, through the snow-covered gardens of London, through the quiet moments of genuine human connection that transcend all hierarchies and conventions. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we express our deepest gratitude for your attention, your engagement, and your willingness to believe in the transformative power of love stories rooted in authenticity and moral courage. May you, like Clara and Adrian, find the strength to choose your own truth. May you, like Adrian, discover the courage to sacrifice everything that society deems valuable in service to what your heart knows to be genuine. And may you, always and eternally, remember that you belong not because anyone has granted you permission, but because you have claimed your own inherent dignity and refuse to surrender it to anyone's judgment but your own. Until our next tale finds you, dear listeners, we remain your devoted storytellers, forever grateful for the privilege of accompanying you on these journeys into the heart of Victorian romance. With profound admiration and eternal gratitude, Victorian Romance Audio Stories.